It's recording. Yep. There you go.
All right. Hello and welcome to the Sprint 69 review. This was a standard 2-week sprint. The only issue is that we had a internal meetup last week. So while a lot of things were discussed, maybe not a lot of PRs were merged during that time. Next slide, please. So as usual, I'll go over the sprint statistics. Updating.
Oh, sorry about that. Oops.
All right, so as usual, I'll go over the sprint stats. Carol will give us an update on the community. Harpreet on the classic UI. There's nothing to report on the service UI for the sprint. On the providers, Bronagh and Adam will update us. On Automatina, on the platform, Gregg, on the API, Alberto, and on documentation, Chris. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, typically we have over 500 PRs merged, but I think because of last week's meetup, we had a smaller amount merged. Next slide, please. In terms of distribution, as we're ramping up towards the release of Gabrinda later this year, we've had more focus on enhancements, so that took up over a third, while bugs were barely over a quarter of the PRs merged. Next slide. Alrighty, so there's kind of the graph, a lot of bouncing up and down. It's good to see us bounce back this sprint in 69, but a little strange that we were even lower last sprint. Maybe it was because of the summer holidays, the August holidays. Next slide, please. All right, and this is our health report for the repos that we're monitoring. So if I look here, the ManageIQ content went down in the number of issues by 16. That's a pretty big change. I don't really see much of anything else changing too much. So health is relatively unchanged in this sprint. Next slide. Over to Carol for the community update.
Hi, thanks, Oleg.
Sure.
Is the audio fine? Hi. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead, Carol.
Can you hear us, Carol?
Apparently not.
Apparently not.
All right.
Carl?
For the last week ManageIQ posts, this past couple of weeks, John and I have been taking a chance at writing this since many of you are busy with the internal all hands meeting. So hope it's interesting nonetheless, and thanks for all the encouragement that you guys have given us. And please let John know if you want to write for the upcoming posts for last week ManageIQ. And then for events, we have the European Ruby Conference in Budapest coming up. Some of you are attending, and again, have a good event and share the.
All right, we can't hear you, Carol.
I think she was.
Pretty close to done?
Yeah.
So next slide. Over to Harpreet.
Hello, everyone. On the classic UI side, we have a little bit lesser PR counts, as Oleg mentioned, due to the internal meetings last week. But we still managed to get some good amount of PRs merged. I have some counts here on this slide. total PRs were merged in Classic UI 73, and out of which 11 were enhancements, 29 bugs, 18 tech debt, and 8 refactoring PRs. We also had about 12 PRs merged in the UI components repo. I don't have any demos or screenshots to share this week, but I have some details on some of the main PRs that were merged. So on the refactoring side, we are continuing to clean up UI constants module. We are moving constants appropriately to helpers and mixins, etc. And some other general cleanup work is in progress to simplify methods and controllers and delete some unused code. Also, the topology JavaScript controllers were converted to use controller as instead of $scope. And on the enhancement side, we added field validations to our new dialog editor. So the validations such as the dialog name or validation to check if the dialog has at least one tab, one box, one element, and those should have name field populated respectively. In absence of any of those, the save button is disabled. Also, the restore and delete button were added to cloud volume screens. And middleware guys have added generate JDR report button on middleware server screens. Once a report is generated, you can see the list of reports on the same screen along with the download or delete those reports buttons. And that's all I have for the Classic UI. Next screen, please.
So on the provider side, we're going to share some updates today from the Amazon, Popular, VMware, and Kubernetes providers. Next slide, please. So most merged PRs this sprint came from the stack providers, followed jointly by Amazon, VMware, Popular, and Kubernetes, and then a sprinkling from the remaining provider repos. Next slide, please. So although graph refresh and targeted refresh is not new support for Amazon this sprint, it is now enabled by default. And the screenshot illustrates which settings in config advanced settings can be turned on or off. Next slide, please. So I'd like to play a demo of the Amazon targeted refresh. So here you'll see I've added a provider I've added an Amazon provider, and I will take a look at one instance. And this instance is powered off. So I will flip over to the Amazon console, and I'll power that same instance on. This is going to trigger an event to be fired from Amazon to ManageIQ, and this event will trigger a targeted refresh via the event switchboard. And this means that only the details for this instance shall be fetched and processed from the Amazon provider. We've refreshed the screen and you'll see the power status is on. So to troubleshoot, you can go through the logs. You can search for the EMS ref of the particular instance. Hard to see in my log, but it shows you just some details of what exactly was fetched and for which instances. Next slide, please. Some of the cloud provider repos have static configuration files that are not editable. We really want to empower end users to be able to choose these files themselves. And one file that that you can already change is the regions file. And the regions file is a static file that lists all of the regions supported by a particular provider. So when the provider adds support for a new region, that region has to be inserted into the regions file. But through advanced settings, the end user can add or disable support for a particular region. And we think this works well. And we've decided to use this as an example for other static provider configuration files. So in this sprint, James Wong exposed the Amazon instance types file. And an Amazon instance type is what we refer to as a flavor. So James has created a demo of how he has exposed these settings. So here we're looking at the instance types for the Amazon provider. We have a short list, so we'll take note of one, and that's the M4.10 extra large. Now we'll switch over to the advanced settings. Scroll down to the Amazon section, and we'll see two new settings have been added. The first is additional instance types, and here James is inserting a new instance type called yet another instance type. And under disabled instance types, he's inserting the M4.10 extra large that we noted earlier. So go back to the Amazon provider, and we'll execute a provider refresh. So factoring in these new settings, we'll take a look at flavors again. And you'll see that we have a new instance type called yet another instance type, and the M4.10 extra large has been removed. Next slide, over to Adam.
Okay, thanks. So as Harpreet mentioned, previous slide. So the middleware team added the ability to generate, download, list, delete JBoss diagnostic reports. And so Alyssa has a short demo here showing that functionality off. So you can see you can go and delete multiple reports in one call. You can download reports, unzip them, and view them locally in your machine. And this works for all of the servers that are belonging to that middleware provider. All right, so now she's generating a new one. This should show in a few seconds that it actually builds it on the server and should be available to download. Okay, and there's that new one, so it's currently running. I think she refreshes again and shows that it successfully was created. Yep, now it's running. So now the download button's available. And downloads it to your local machine. So you can open it up, see what's in there, and help diagnose the issues with that server. All right, next slide. Similar to the Amazon provider, the Kubernetes guys turned on graph refresh by default, both for Kubernetes and for OpenShift. And it's the same configuration variables that Bronagh mentioned, that inventory object refresh. If there's an issue, you can go back to that. They also added a new feature so that container templates can have labels. That was sort of a long-term, there were a lot of PRs involved, had been open for months, and it finally got in the sprint, so that's exciting. And the Overt guys are now using the V4 API by default. So I know there are a couple of issues with the older V3 API that using the V4 API will be resolved. So that has the benefit of staying with the newer version as well as sort of implicitly fixing some issues. Next slide.
One second, just mute.
And for VMware, another one that's sort of been out there for a while, and this was found during our re-architecture investigation into metrics collection. We found a few things that we can do to improve VMware metrics collection. The first one made it in this sprint, which is to request CSV format. So instead of the virtual center converting their CSV metrics to XML to send to us, and then we just parse it anyway, they can send directly in CSV. It reduces time and memory usage by about 25%. Both. So that's exciting. There's a few more things that we're going to get in coming sprints in this area. Yeah. Next slide. Over to Tina.
Yes, good morning. So at Automate, we had 16 PRs merged this sprint. We had 11 enhancements, 2 bugs, 2 refactoring, 1 technical debt. I want to call out a few of the enhancements. Madhu continued his work on the Automate Workspace with a new Automate Workspace model that has the ability to serialize and deserialize a workspace. This is a really powerful enhancement because it gives external methods the ability to retrieve and update the Automate Workspace to be used by the API and in the Ansible playbook integration. Lucy continued her work on the generic object enhancements by adding custom buttons and enhancement modifications for the API. And Harpreet added a new Ansible playbook method type in addition to the inline and built-in URI and expression. Next slide, please. Gregg added a provisioning modification that has to do with provisioning dialogues to force auto placement. This enables support for dialogues with limited environment placement that still need to use the auto placement functionality for the rest of the required fields. The Rev team added a performance enhancement to use targeted refresh for the add and remove template events. And finally, Bill continued his work on moving orchestration templates to the provider repos. And that's it for Automate. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks, Dana. On the platform side, actually, we increased the number of PRs merged this month, this sprint, sorry. And I think when you see how many slides Alberto has,
I apologize.
You'll understand why. So a couple of enhancements and bug fixes to point out. So Joe Raffanello made a change so that all the tools in the tools directory can be run without loading Rails runner. So you could just run the script directly. And so going forward, we'd like to do it this way for any tools that get added. So you'd want to make the file, the file executable. You won't have the shebang at the top and require the Rails environment if you need it for that. And there's an example right there. So he did that for all of them. Joe V created a new tool that he's been working on for a really long time to convert MIQ LDAP auth to external auth with SSSD. And on the next slide, he's going to talk about that in a bit of detail. So I'll let him do that. And then for bug fixes, another change to external authentication to do matching as case and sensitive search if we can't find matching user ID as is when you're logging in. This handles a situation where if you manually added a user and you did it in mixed case and there's a bug for that, you weren't able to log in because we're looking for it as you typed it. So you'd have to type it in exactly the same case as it is in the database. So that's been fixed. And Libor made a change to chargeback so that we basically use all the tags across the reporting period to determine the rate assignments and to pull in the rates. Previously, we were actually only looking at the first, basically the tags on the first metric in the reporting period, and that really doesn't work out so well when if you change tags during the period, you wouldn't pick up the right rate. So that's a pretty big change. That's it for this slide. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Joe V.
Hey, okay, hi. Am I being heard okay?
Yep.
I got a thumbs up from Keenan, so I guess that's a yes. So MIQ has had a built-in LDAP client for many years. Unfortunately, we have to maintain it. Configuring our MIQ LDAP client actually is fairly simple and something that the field is very familiar with. MIQ has also support for LDAP via an external auth mechanism. However, manually configuring this can be a bit daunting. We want to get out of the business of maintaining our own authentication tooling. So we plan to do this by leveraging the LDAP authentication stack that's already available in the OS. Our LDAP client library will be available, but deprecated in the G release, and we will no longer be available once we get to the H release. So the new MIQ LDAP to SSD tool that I've been working on for what seems like a lifetime, chipping away at, can be used by customers to simplify making the switch from internal LDAP library to using external auth LDAP. And this will allow folks to, as Alberto and I like to say, kick the tires. Told you I'd get that in there, Alberto. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. There we go. So I thought I'd just briefly give a summary of what the tool actually does. So it runs authconfig to seed an SSSD configuration, and then it customizes this SSSD seedling based on the current appliance configuration. It does a little twiddling for the Apache configuration just a bit, And then it does some security magic setup for the transport layer security and SE Linux. And finally, it updates the database with new appliance authentication settings. And that's it for me. That's a good summary. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Alberto so he can give us an update on the API.
Alrighty. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
So it was definitely a busy sprint for the API. No rest for us here. Huh?
Nice.
All right, so we have a couple of enhancements that came in this sprint. First one is by Stephen. So we have a new collection for guest devices and the standard query on the collection, the resources, as well as the bulk queries for that. He also added enhancements to the physical servers collection, adding new actions for power off, restart to setup, and restart the management controller. As standard, this is supported on the resources themselves as well as doing bulk operations on multiple physical servers. Next slide, please. Okay, so one enhancement that Jillian did this sprint is for the service dialogues. Whenever we had creates or updates, the callers did not get the full content of the dialogue. So the one enhancement here was to return, the dialogue tabs and all the necessary spec there. So that was by Jillian. Next slide, please. Okay. So to extend the previous generic object definition from last sprint, while in the initial implementation you could define the whole generic object, but you couldn't have fine-grained control of what things you need to do, like removing a single association or method. So what Jillian did is basically introduce the actions that, again, can be done on a single resource or in bulk. Showing here an example, we're removing the attributes, a couple of attributes for the one generic object definition. So that gives better control for the caller. Next slide, please. All right. So one thing we were missing was one thing that was needed was the put HTTP method, similar to what we do for a post edit on the generic object definition. That was done by Jillian. And next enhancements Brandon did for the API, we needed a ping endpoint, basically to know whenever the API server was ready, and you get the standard text response of pong. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have one enhancement by Aparna. So what she's done is add the data definition for the generic object definitions options, and showing you here the snippet on the bottom for the allowed association types and allowed types, and that helps the UI generates the pull down that's needed for that goodness. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have another enhancement from Erez. This is for the options for the providers. Similarly, to assist the UI for building the dynamic the UI on these options, and you can see in the data portion of the providers, you get the provider settings for each different types. Next slide, please. Okay, so one thing that we were missing in the user resource, so one enhancement we needed that Jillian did was to be able to edit the current group of the user. That was because earlier you could, obviously edit your email, your password, but we didn't allow the current group. So Jillian did that. And the other enhancement was to be able to edit all the groups of a user. So again, given that you have the right entitlement and role for that, you can specify which groups you belong to. Next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of work went into the generic objects themselves. So Jillian did that enhancement this sprint. So we have now full CRUD support for generic objects. Here's the standard list of the gets on the collection, the resource. You can also get the associations with it, the VMs and services as an example here. And the standard creates, you got the post, the edits, bulk actions edits, and as well as the delete methods. So, the next slide, please. All right, so that kind of gives you the an example of what a generic object looks like. So you have the base model attributes, ID, href, name, generic object definition, ID, but you also have the property attributes that are defined from the generic object definition for that, as well as the relationships for a generic object. So in this case, example as VMs and services. Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, this was just merged in lately. So Tim did this enhancement. So when we had initially in the API, our IDs were numeric, and that used to cause issues with JavaScript when the numbers were kind of large. So at some point, we decided to go with our compressed ID syntax, which was convenient, was short and strings. But that added complexity to the UI side, dealing with dialogues and referencing all this stuff in there. So what we did is roll back the compressed ID, but still go to the string format, but simply the uncompressed IDs, as you see now here. So the IDs and hrefs will have the stringified, string of the ID number. So that's outbound. So anything that you get back from the API would be that. Inbound, we still accept compressed ID because that was available in the fine release, but we'll deprecate that in the G release, and H release, even inbound, would be all uncompressed. But that was a lot of work by Tim. Had to review a PR with 62 files changed. So very nice. And I think that's it. Next slide, please.
Hi, for documentation in this sprint, we had 13 PRs merged, 11 of which were enhancements, 2 of which addressed bugs. Some highlights there, we made changes to the LDAP group role example doc to improve readability, added info about setting credentials for VMware and an IPv6 network. There's a nice end-to-end example of how to provision Rev VM, and additionally, we added some info about tenants when adding OpenStack providers. That's it. Next slide, please.
All right. So that kind of ends the Sprint 69 review. We'll be back in 2 weeks to do the next sprint review. Thanks, everyone.